The gunshot did not echo the way it should have. It cracked once, sharp and intimate, swallowed by the heavy curtains and thick carpet of the hotel suite, and Daniel realized in the same breath that the blood on his hands was warmer than it had any right to be. Lila's body jerked against him, not dramatically, not like in films, but with a small, confused twitch, as if she had misstepped on a stair she hadn't seen. For half a second he thought she was pretending, that this was another one of her tests, another cruel way to measure how quickly he would panic for her. Then he saw the widening stain under her ribs and understood that whatever game they had been playing for the last 2 years had just escalated beyond anything he could control. "I didn't mean to," he said, though he was not sure who he was speaking to, because Lila's eyes were open but already unfocused, and the man across the room was lowering the silenced pistol with an expression that suggested irritation rather than triumph. Marcus had always looked bored in moments of catastrophe. He slipped the weapon into his coat as if it were an inconvenience and stepped closer, studying Daniel with clinical detachment. "You weren't supposed to be holding her," Marcus said quietly. "That complicates the narrative." Daniel felt something tear inside his chest. Not grief yet, not rage, but the awareness that even now, as Lila bled against him, Marcus was thinking about optics. "Call an ambulance," Daniel said, pressing his palm harder against the wound, as if pressure alone could reverse physics. Marcus tilted his head. "If I call an ambulance, you go to prison," he replied. "If I don't, you still might. The difference is whether you understand why." Daniel stared at him, trying to assemble logic from fragments, but all he could see was Lila's mouth moving soundlessly, forming a word he could not hear. She had warned him about this without ever being explicit. Weeks earlier, she had stood at the balcony of this same suite, looking down at the city like it was a board she was rearranging, and she had said, "If something happens to me, promise you won't assume you're the victim." He had laughed at the time, thinking it was another philosophical jab, another attempt to humble him. Now her breath came in shallow pulls against his wrist, and he understood that she had never been speaking abstractly. She had known the board was unstable. Marcus crouched beside them and reached out, not to comfort, but to check Daniel's hands. "Your fingerprints are everywhere," he murmured. "On her dress, on the glass, on the balcony door. You insisted on staying close tonight. That will look possessive." Daniel wanted to lunge at him, to break his composed face, but if he moved his hands, the blood would flow faster. "You shot her," Daniel whispered. Marcus did not deny it. He simply said, "I solved a problem. Whether you become the next one depends on how well you listen." The air in the room felt thick, as if oxygen itself had chosen a side. Daniel's mind split in 2 directions, one half clinging to Lila's fading pulse, the other calculating the implications of Marcus's calm. He had always known Marcus was dangerous, but he had believed that danger was external, reserved for competitors, journalists, anyone who threatened the empire they had built. He had not considered that he himself might be repositioned as a threat. "She trusted me," Daniel said, though the sentence sounded hollow even to him. Marcus gave a faint smile. "She trusted everyone until she didn't." Lila coughed, and a thin thread of blood slid from the corner of her mouth. Daniel leaned closer, desperate to catch whatever she was trying to say. "Don't let him," she began, and the rest dissolved into a wet exhale. Marcus's jaw tightened for the first time. "She always underestimated timing," he muttered. Daniel felt the words land like a verdict. Timing, as if this were a scheduling error rather than an execution. He thought about the first time he had met Lila, at a fundraising gala, where she had worn a white dress that made her look untouchable. She had approached him, not the other way around, and had said, "You look like someone who wants to be necessary." He had been offended, then intrigued, then addicted. Over months, she had woven herself into every decision he made, every risk he took, convincing him that he was not merely an employee but an essential axis of her operation. Now, kneeling on the carpet with her blood soaking into his cuffs, he realized that necessity was a leash. Marcus stood and walked toward the minibar, pouring himself a drink with unhurried precision. "There will be an investigation," he said. "The official story is that you and Lila argued. She threatened to expose irregularities in your department. You panicked." Daniel felt his stomach drop. "That's a lie." Marcus took a sip. "It's a structure. People prefer structures to chaos." "You think I'll just accept that?" Daniel demanded, his voice cracking. Marcus looked at him with something approaching pity. "You already have," he replied. "You're still holding her. You're still trying to save her. You haven't once tried to stop me from leaving." The observation struck with humiliating accuracy. Daniel had not moved. He had chosen proximity to Lila's dying body over any attempt at revenge or escape. In that choice was the outline of his weakness. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, not yet near enough to belong to them. Daniel wondered if Marcus had called someone after all, some private contact to stage the scene. Why? He asked, the question finally surfacing. Marcus considered it. Because she was becoming unpredictable, he said. Because she thought she could dismantle what we built and walk away untouched. Because she started confiding in you. The last reason hung heavier than the others. I never betrayed you, Daniel said, though the statement felt naive as soon as it left his mouth. Marcus set his glass down with deliberate care. Betrayal isn't about action, he said. It's about potential. You had potential. Daniel felt the world tilt. All his late nights, his ruthless negotiations, his willingness to fire people who begged for mercy. All of it had been proof of loyalty in his mind. To Marcus, it had been proof that Daniel could one day compete. Lila's pulse fluttered under Daniel's fingers and then weakened to a thread. He felt the exact moment it slipped, not dramatically, but like a door closing in another room. He stayed frozen, waiting for a miracle that did not arrive. Marcus approached again and looked down at her with a brief, unreadable expression. It's done, he said softly. Daniel did not cry. The absence of tears felt like another accusation. There was a knock at the door, sharp and official. Marcus straightened his coat. Remember, he said. Panic looks guilty. Grief looks sympathetic. Choose wisely. He walked toward the entrance as if he were hosting a dinner party rather than orchestrating a murder. Daniel remained on the floor, Lila's body heavy against him, and understood that whatever happened next would not be about truth but about narrative ownership. The police entered with controlled urgency, their eyes scanning, assessing. Daniel let his shoulders shake, not entirely forced, because the horror was real, even if the script was not his. An officer knelt beside him, checking Lila's neck, confirming what Daniel already knew. What happened? The officer asked. Daniel opened his mouth and felt Marcus's gaze like a hand on the back of his skull. If he accused Marcus now, would anyone believe him? Marcus had no blood on his clothes, no weapon visible, no sign of struggle. We argued, Daniel heard himself say. The words tasted metallic. She said she was going to ruin me. He stopped, aware that he was stepping into the frame Marcus had designed. The officer's expression shifted, subtle but significant. And then, Daniel looked down at his stained hands. There was a gun, he said. He did not specify whose. As paramedics moved Lila's body onto a stretcher, Daniel felt something fracture inside him. Not love, not loyalty, but the illusion that he had ever been steering his own life. Marcus stood near the window, speaking quietly with another officer, his posture composed, cooperative. From a distance, he looked like a concerned partner. Daniel realized with cold clarity that Marcus had not just removed Lila, he had repositioned Daniel as the next unstable element. In the back of the police car, Daniel replayed every conversation he had had with Lila in the past month, the way she had asked about contingency plans, the way she had watched Marcus during meetings, as if measuring him, the way she had touched Daniel's wrist and said, "You think you're protected because you're useful." He had thought she was warning him about external threats. Now he saw that she had been describing Marcus. At the station, under fluorescent lights that flattened everything into procedural monotony, Daniel gave his statement again, refining it, adjusting tone and detail. He avoided direct accusations. He emphasized confusion, fear, the heat of the moment. Each omission felt like a small betrayal of Lila's final, unfinished sentence. Don't let him. The words echoed without completion, forcing Daniel to supply possibilities. Don't let him win. Don't let him rewrite this. Don't let him survive. Hours later, alone in an interrogation room, Daniel pressed his palms against the metal table and considered his options. If he fully blamed Marcus now, without evidence, it would look like deflection. If he stayed within the narrative Marcus had drafted, he might secure bail, time, space, to think. The cost of that time would be public suspicion, perhaps charges. Saving himself legally might condemn him morally. There were no clean choices. Saving one version of himself would damage another irreparably. When Marcus finally entered the room, escorted by an officer who then left them under the pretense of privacy, Daniel felt the air sharpen again. Marcus closed the door and sat opposite him, folding his hands. You did well, he said. Daniel stared at him, unable to mask his hatred. You killed her, he replied, voice low but steady. Marcus leaned forward. I removed volatility, he corrected. Now the question is whether you become manageable. Daniel felt a dangerous clarity settle in. You think this ends with me playing along forever, he said. Marcus studied him, eyes narrowing slightly. I think you value survival, he answered. And survival, for you, requires me. The arrogance of it ignited something in Daniel. Not a burst of reckless anger, but a slow, corrosive resolve. Leela's last words pressed against his skull. "Don't let him." "You're wrong," Daniel said quietly. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "About which part?" he asked. Daniel held his gaze. "About me needing you," he replied. For a fraction of a second, Marcus's composure faltered, not dramatically, but enough for Daniel to see calculation recalibrating. In that micro-shift, Daniel understood that he had not yet lost completely. Marcus feared unpredictability. He feared variables he could not map. The door opened again, interrupting the charged silence, and an officer informed Daniel that he was being formally charged pending further investigation. Bail would be discussed in the morning. Marcus stood smoothly, adjusting his cuffs. "Rest," he said to Daniel, almost gently. "We have a long road ahead." As he left, Daniel felt the weight of the cell already closing around him, not just physically, but psychologically. In the holding cell that night, surrounded by strangers whose crimes were simpler and more visible, Daniel lay on the narrow bench and stared at the ceiling. Every scenario branched into damage. If he exposed Marcus recklessly, he might be discredited or silenced permanently. If he gathered evidence carefully, he would have to pretend loyalty, perhaps even assist in further harm. Protecting Lila's memory might require him to become complicit in the very system that killed her. He closed his eyes and saw her on the balcony again, city lights reflecting in her pupils. "You want to matter," she had said. He had thought she meant professionally. Now he realized she had been testing whether he could endure the cost of mattering. The gunshot had been the beginning, not the climax. The real violence would be slower, bureaucratic, psychological. By dawn, Daniel had made a decision that did not feel heroic, only necessary. He would not confront Marcus head-on. He would not confess everything to the police and hope for justice. Instead, he would learn the full architecture of the empire he had helped build. Every hidden account, every manipulated contract, every compromised official. To dismantle Marcus, he would first have to understand how deeply he himself was entangled. When the guard came to escort him to the bail hearing, Daniel stood with measured calm. He felt hollowed out, but within the hollow was a new, colder intention. Marcus believed he could script outcomes by controlling immediate narratives. Daniel would aim for something slower and more devastating. Not an explosion, but erosion. As he walked down the corridor, he understood that Lila's death had not freed him. It had tethered him more tightly to Marcus than ever before. To save himself legally, he might have to defend Marcus publicly. To destroy Marcus privately, he might have to sacrifice whatever remained of his reputation. There would be no version of this story where he emerged clean. And somewhere beneath the strategy, beneath the calculation, was a quieter, more terrifying realization. Part of him still wanted Marcus's approval, still measured his worth against the older man's appraisal. That craving was the deepest vulnerability of all. Until he severed it, any plan he formed would be compromised from within. He stepped into the courtroom and saw Marcus already seated, composed, surrounded by lawyers. Their eyes met briefly, and in that glance was an unspoken understanding that the war between them would not be loud. It would be intimate. It would unfold in boardrooms and back channels, in whispered suggestions and carefully planted doubts. Lila's blood had been the opening move. Daniel took his seat, hands clasped to hide their tremor, and felt the narrative tightening around him. He was both suspect and pawn, victim and potential threat. The judge began to speak, outlining charges, conditions, timelines. Each word felt like another brick in a structure designed to contain him. Yet beneath the weight of accusation, Daniel felt something else forming. Not hope, not redemption, but a willingness to endure prolonged corrosion if it meant destabilizing the man who believed himself untouchable. The cost would be immense. Relationships would fracture. Allies would be sacrificed. His own moral boundaries would blur beyond recognition. But as the gavel struck and the next phase began, Daniel understood that the real question was no longer whether he had pulled the trigger. It was whether he would allow Marcus to define the rest of his life, and the question did not feel rhetorical. It felt like a contract being slid across a table, unsigned but binding all the same. Daniel kept his expression neutral as the judge outlined the conditions of his temporary release, the travel restrictions, the requirement to surrender his passport, the scheduled review in 6 weeks. Each condition narrowed his physical movement while widening the psychological battlefield, because Marcus thrived in confined arenas where perception could be engineered. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited like predators, sensing fresh blood. Microphones pushed forward, questions overlapping in aggressive fragments. Did you kill her? Were you two involved romantically? Was there financial misconduct? Daniel had been trained for hostile negotiations, but this was different. This was not about winning. It was about surviving, without confirming the story Marcus had seeded. He paused just long enough to appear devastated, not rehearsed. Lila was my colleague and my friend, he said carefully. What happened was a tragedy. I'm cooperating fully. He avoided the word innocent. Marcus had once told him that innocent sounded defensive. Marcus stood a few steps behind, flanked by counsel, offering a measured statement about grief and transparency. Daniel watched him from the corner of his eye and realized that Marcus's greatest weapon was not ruthlessness but patience. He did not rush outcomes. He curated them. That meant Daniel would have to endure prolonged suspicion without retaliating prematurely. Any impulsive accusation would only confirm instability. That evening, Daniel returned to his apartment under quiet escort. The space felt unfamiliar, as if someone had rearranged the emotional furniture while he was gone. Lila had been there 3 nights before she died, sitting at the edge of his couch, flipping through documents he had left carelessly on the table. She had looked up and said, "You think transparency protects you. It just shows people where to aim." He had thought she was referring to regulators. Now he suspected she had meant Marcus. He poured himself a drink and let it sit untouched. The silence pressed in, heavy and accusatory. If he was going to dismantle Marcus, he needed leverage, not outrage. He opened his laptop and began mapping everything he knew about the company's off-book operations. Shell corporations, in jurisdictions chosen for opacity, contracts routed through intermediaries who owed Marcus favors, payments disguised as consulting fees. Daniel had overseen parts of it, believing it was strategic necessity. Now every line item felt like a potential weapon. If only he could extract proof without exposing his own complicity. His phone vibrated. The name on the screen tightened his chest. Elena, Lila's younger sister. He hesitated before answering, aware that anything he said could become a liability. "Tell me it isn't true," Elena said immediately, her voice raw. Daniel closed his eyes. "I wish I could," he replied. There was a long silence on the line, filled with restrained breathing. "They're saying you did it," she said finally. "Did you?" The directness forced him into a moral corner. "I didn't shoot her," Daniel said, choosing precision over simplicity. Elena caught the nuance. "That's not what I asked," she replied. The accusation in her tone cut deeper than the media frenzy. "I would never have hurt her," he said. And for the first time since the gunshot, the statement felt fully true. Hurt did not require a trigger. He had hurt Lila by participating in the machinery she was trying to destabilize. Elena's voice hardened. "She was scared," she said. "She told me someone close to her was changing, that she didn't know who to trust." Daniel's pulse spiked. "Did she say who?" he asked. "No," Elena replied. "But she said, if anything happened, I should look at the people who benefited." The implication hung heavy. If Daniel moved against Marcus too openly, Elena might assume he was deflecting guilt. If he stayed silent, she might believe the worst. "Don't talk to the press," Daniel said carefully. "Not yet. Let the investigation unfold." Elena let out a bitter laugh. "That sounds exactly like something someone protecting themselves would say." The line went dead before he could respond. Daniel stared at the dark screen, aware that in trying to shield her from premature exposure, he had likely deepened her suspicion. Saving her from public scrutiny might cost him any remaining trust she had. The next morning, Marcus requested a private meeting at the office. Daniel considered refusing, but absence could be framed as instability. Presence, at least, offered visibility. He entered the executive floor under the watchful eyes of employees who suddenly regarded him as volatile. Whispers trailed him down the corridor. In the glass walls, he saw his own reflection, composed but hollow. Marcus waited in the boardroom, sunlight diffused through tinted windows. "You look tired," Marcus observed, as if commenting on weather. Daniel took a seat opposite him. "You look unaffected," he replied. Marcus allowed a faint smile. "Grief manifests differently," he said. "For some it paralyzes, for others it clarifies." Daniel felt the subtle challenge embedded in the statement. Paralysis would confirm Marcus's dominance. Clarity would threaten it. "We need alignment," Marcus continued. "The board is nervous. Investors are skittish. Your arrest destabilized confidence." Daniel leaned back slightly. "Your solution?" he asked. Marcus folded his hands. "You take a temporary leave. Publicly, you focus on clearing your name. I handle operations." The proposal sounded reasonable, even protective. In reality, it would remove Daniel from access to internal systems, from quiet observation. "If I step back," Daniel said slowly, "I lose oversight." Marcus's gaze sharpened. "You lost oversight the moment you lost control of your temper," he replied. The accusation was deliberate. There had been no temper, only a staged narrative. Careful, Daniel said quietly. You're implying something. Marcus held his stare. I'm implying perception, and perception is currently against you. Daniel understood the trap. If he resisted stepping back, it would appear self-serving. If he agreed, he would be voluntarily blind. I'll take the leave, he said finally. Marcus's satisfaction was almost imperceptible, but Daniel saw it. Good, Marcus said. Rest. Recalibrate. Let me contain the damage. Contain the damage. As if Leela's death were a public relations inconvenience. After the meeting, Daniel accessed what files he still could before formal restrictions tightened. He downloaded innocuous-looking reports, financial summaries that masked deeper anomalies. He encrypted copies and stored them off-site, aware that discovery would look like guilt. Every protective measure risked reinforcing suspicion. The balance required precision. That afternoon, he received an unexpected message from Thomas, the company's compliance officer. We need to talk, the text read. Thomas had always seemed anxious, perpetually aware of the thin line they walked. Daniel met him in a cafe 2 blocks from the office, choosing a public space for safety. Thomas looked thinner than usual, his eyes darting toward the door every few seconds. They're auditing us, Thomas said, without preamble. Regulators, quietly. It started before what happened. Daniel's mind accelerated. Before Lila died? He asked. Thomas nodded. She knew, he said. She requested internal reviews. She was digging. The confirmation tightened the narrative. Lila had not been emotionally volatile. She had been methodical. Did Marcus know about the audit? Daniel asked. Thomas hesitated. I can't prove it, he said. But nothing significant happens without him sensing it. Daniel leaned forward. If regulators find irregularities, who takes the fall? Thomas gave a strained laugh. Whoever is easiest to frame as rogue. The implication was obvious. Help me, Daniel said quietly. Thomas recoiled slightly. Help you how? Daniel chose his words with care. Document everything. Preserve communications. If I'm going down, I won't go alone. Thomas swallowed. That sounds like a threat. Daniel shook his head. It's a contingency. The difference was thin. Thomas stared into his coffee. You think Marcus would sacrifice you? He asked. Daniel thought of the gunshot, of the calm recalibration in Marcus's eyes. I know he would, he replied. Thomas exhaled slowly. If I help you and this backfires, I lose everything, he said. Daniel met his gaze. If you don't, you might lose it anyway. There were no comforting options to offer. When Daniel left the cafe, he felt the weight of another fragile alliance forming. Thomas was not loyal. He was scared. Fear could motivate, but it could also collapse under pressure. Daniel would have to protect him just enough to maintain cooperation without revealing the full extent of his plan. Trust would be transactional, provisional. That night, Elena appeared at his door unannounced. Her eyes were swollen, but her posture was rigid. I'm not here to argue, she said before he could speak. I'm here to see if you're capable of telling the truth when no one's watching. Daniel stepped aside to let her in, aware that any defensiveness would be interpreted as guilt. She stood in the center of the living room, scanning the space as if searching for hidden evidence. Did she find something? Elena asked. Daniel's instinct was to deny knowledge, to shield both himself and the fragile investigation forming. But Lila's last words echoed. Don't let him. Yes, he said carefully. She was looking into financial misconduct. Elena's jaw tightened. And you were part of it, she demanded. I was part of decisions I didn't fully question, Daniel admitted. The partial confession felt dangerous, but total denial would be hollow. That's not an answer, Elena said. It's the beginning of one, he replied. She studied him, searching for manipulation. If you're protecting someone, she said slowly, I will destroy you myself. The threat was not theatrical. It was sincere. I'm not protecting him, Daniel said, choosing the pronoun deliberately. Elena caught it. Him, she repeated. So there is someone. Daniel exhaled. There's a structure, he said, and at the top of it is someone who doesn't lose. Elena's eyes sharpened. Marcus, she said. It was not a question. Daniel did not confirm verbally. He did not need to. Elena stepped back, absorbing the implication. If you're lying to me, I will never forgive you, she said. If you're telling the truth and you hesitate, I will never forgive you either. The ultimatum tightened the pressure. Acting too soon could sabotage any chance of exposing Marcus. Acting too slowly could cost Elena's trust permanently. After she left, Daniel sat alone and recognized the escalating cost. To dismantle Marcus legally, he would need evidence strong enough to survive scrutiny. To gather that evidence, He might have to participate in decisions that harmed others. To protect Elena from retaliation, he might have to keep her partially in the dark, deepening her resentment. Every move to save one relationship risked collapsing another. Days turned into a rhythm of strategic restraint. Daniel attended mandated check-ins with his attorney, who advised caution above all else. "Do not antagonize Marcus publicly," the lawyer said. "We need him cooperative." Cooperative. The word felt grotesque. Meanwhile, Marcus sent occasional messages, neutral in tone, inquiring about Daniel's well-being. The civility was suffocating. One evening, Daniel received an encrypted file from Thomas. It contained internal emails showing Lila requesting independent audits and Marcus redirecting oversight to external consultants with close ties to him. The language was subtle, plausible, not overtly criminal, but suggestive of obstruction. Daniel stared at the screen, understanding that this was a thread, not a rope. Pulling it prematurely would alert Marcus. His phone rang again. This time, it was an unknown number. He answered cautiously. "You're being watched," a distorted voice said before the line cut. Daniel's pulse spiked. Paranoia was a predictable byproduct of his situation, but the warning felt specific. He scanned his apartment, suddenly aware of every reflective surface. He considered contacting Marcus directly, testing whether the threat was intimidation, but that would reveal vulnerability. Instead, he contacted Thomas discreetly. "Has anyone asked about you?" Daniel texted. The reply came minutes later. "Marcus requested full access logs today. Why?" Daniel's stomach tightened. The audit was tightening. Marcus was not passive. He was anticipating. Daniel realized that the war had already shifted phases. It was no longer about public narrative alone. It was about internal surveillance, about who moved first. If Marcus suspected Daniel was gathering evidence, he would accelerate containment. That could mean discrediting Thomas, altering records, or provoking Daniel into a misstep that justified harsher legal action. Standing in the dim light of his living room, Daniel understood that hesitation was now its own form of risk. Lila had tried to expose something and had been eliminated. If he moved clumsily, he would follow. If he moved too cautiously, Marcus would entrench further. He opened the encrypted file again and began drafting a contingency plan, outlining steps to secure additional documentation, identifying board members who might harbor quiet doubts about Marcus's methods. Each name represented a potential ally or a potential leak. Trust would have to be tested incrementally. As midnight deepened, Daniel felt the strain settle into his bones. He was fighting on multiple fronts: legal defense, corporate maneuvering, Elena's fragile trust, Thomas's fear, and beneath all of it, the unresolved grief for Lila, which he had not allowed himself to process. Mourning would have to wait. Vulnerability could not be indulged. Yet in the quiet, her voice returned, not as accusation, but as challenge. "You want to be necessary." He finally understood that necessity was not about being indispensable to Marcus's empire. It was about being willing to endure isolation for a purpose larger than reputation. He closed his laptop and stood by the window, looking down at the city lights Lila had once compared to a circuit board. Somewhere within that grid, Marcus was recalculating. Daniel felt the tension coiling tighter. Not breaking, not resolving. The next move would determine not just legal outcomes, but the moral shape of who he would become. And as he turned away from the glass, he understood with cold certainty that whatever line he crossed next, there would be no return to the version of himself who had believed he was merely ambitious rather than complicit. The realization did not paralyze him. It clarified the stakes. Ambition had once been a ladder, each rung visible and rationalized. Now it was a trapdoor, and beneath it waited exposure, prison, or something quieter and more permanent. The following morning, Daniel requested a meeting with two board members who had historically clashed with Marcus over risk tolerance. He framed the request as concern for corporate stability, not accusation. In the conference call that followed, he kept his tone measured. "We're facing regulatory scrutiny," he said. "Public confidence is fragile. If leadership appears opaque, the damage compounds." He did not mention Lila's audit directly. He did not accuse Marcus. Instead, he let implications hover, heavy but unspecific. One of the board members, Caroline, responded with cautious interest. "Are you suggesting internal mismanagement?" she asked. Daniel chose his answer carefully. "I'm suggesting that centralizing decision-making during a crisis can create blind spots," he replied. It was not a lie. It was not the full truth either. Caroline's silence stretched. Then she said, "Submit a written memo outlining your concerns." The invitation was dangerous. A written memo could be subpoenaed. It could also be leaked. After the call, Daniel sat with the tension vibrating through him. If he documented suspicions without proof, Marcus could frame it as desperation. If he withheld concerns, he risked allowing Marcus to consolidate control unchallenged. He drafted a neutral memo, emphasizing governance best practices, suggesting temporary oversight committees. It was procedural, almost bland. Beneath the blandness was a seed of doubt. Thomas texted an hour later. Marcus called an emergency executive session tonight. The timing was precise. Marcus had sensed movement. Daniel felt the pressure shift from slow erosion to accelerated containment. If Marcus was consolidating loyalty, Daniel would need something tangible soon. Not rumors, not cautious memos, evidence. He drove to a storage unit on the outskirts of the city, one Lila had once mentioned in passing when discussing backup archives. Never trust centralized servers, she had said with a faint smile. Physical copies survive digital purges. At the time, Daniel had assumed she was being dramatic. Now he hoped she had been methodical. The unit was small, secured with a standard lock. Daniel hesitated before cutting it open, aware that trespassing on Lila's property could be interpreted as tampering, yet leaving potential evidence untouched might mean losing it forever. He cut the lock and stepped inside. Boxes lined the walls, labeled in Lila's neat handwriting. Financial reviews, vendor assessments, personal. He opened the financial box first. Inside were printed spreadsheets, annotated in red ink, highlighting discrepancies between reported expenses and actual transfers. Some transfers led to shell entities Daniel recognized from his own oversight. Others were unfamiliar. His chest tightened. Lila had been mapping the architecture more thoroughly than he had realized. At the bottom of the box lay a sealed envelope addressed to Elena. Daniel stared at it, torn between respect and urgency. If he left it unopened, he risked missing critical context. If he opened it, he violated Lila's explicit boundary. The decision felt symbolic. Protect Elena's autonomy, or accelerate justice. He broke the seal. The letter was brief but devastating in its precision. Lila outlined her suspicion that Marcus had diverted funds into private accounts linked to political intermediaries. She wrote that Daniel was too close to see clearly, but not malicious. She warned that if she confronted Marcus without leverage, she might not survive professionally or otherwise. The phrase lingered. Or otherwise. Daniel folded the letter slowly. Lila had anticipated risk, even lethal risk, and she had still proceeded. The contrast between her resolve and his initial paralysis burned. He photographed the contents of the box and resealed everything as best he could, aware that any sign of intrusion could alert Marcus if he monitored the unit. On his way back to the city, his phone buzzed repeatedly. News alerts. A leak had surfaced, suggesting Daniel had been under internal investigation for months. The narrative was tightening around him. Marcus was not waiting. He was preemptively isolating Daniel. Daniel called his attorney immediately. "This changes optics," the lawyer said. "We need to counter the narrative." Daniel stared at the road ahead. "No," he replied. "We need to outflank it." Countering publicly would appear defensive. Outflanking required strategic disclosure. That evening, Daniel requested to attend the executive session despite his leave. Marcus agreed, perhaps confident in his dominance. The boardroom felt colder than usual. Marcus opened the meeting with a statement about transparency and unity. "We must present a cohesive front," he said. "Internal fractures only embolden regulators." Daniel listened, then waited for a pause. "Transparency requires access," he said evenly. "I propose an independent forensic audit overseen by the board, not executive leadership." The room stilled. Marcus's expression did not change, but a subtle tension entered his jaw. "We are already cooperating fully," Marcus replied. "An additional audit suggests guilt. Refusing one suggests fear," Daniel countered. The words landed heavier than he intended. A board member shifted uncomfortably. Marcus leaned back slightly. "Is this about clearing your name?" he asked. The trap was obvious. If Daniel admitted self-interest, his proposal would look self-serving. "This is about clearing all our names," Daniel replied. He slid a printed page across the table. It was one of Lila's annotated spreadsheets, red marks visible but not fully explained. "These discrepancies require explanation," he said. He did not mention the letter. "Not yet." Marcus glanced at the page and then at Daniel. "Where did you obtain this?" he asked calmly. Daniel held his gaze. "From internal records," he said. It was technically true. The silence that followed was not confusion. It was recalculation. Caroline spoke first. "I support an independent review," she said. Another board member nodded reluctantly. The momentum was fragile, but present. Marcus clasped his hands together. "Very well," he said. "If the board insists." His agreement was too smooth. Daniel recognized the pivot. Marcus would not block the audit. He would prepare for it. After the meeting, Marcus approached Daniel privately. "You're accelerating timelines," he said softly. Daniel did not flinch. "So are you," he replied. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. "You think you're protecting her memory," he said. "You're destabilizing everything she helped build." The inversion was deliberate, reframing accountability as betrayal. "She tried to fix it," Daniel said. Marcus stepped closer. "She tried to control it," he corrected. "There's a difference." Daniel felt the old pull of Marcus's certainty, the temptation to doubt his own interpretation. He forced himself to hold the line. "We'll let the audit decide," he said. Marcus's voice dropped lower. "Audits reveal numbers," he said. "They don't reveal loyalty." The implication was clear. Marcus viewed Daniel's move as treason. The emotional severance was nearly complete. That night, Daniel sent Elena a copy of the letter he had found, along with a message. She knew the risks. He expected anger at the breach of privacy. Instead, she called him, her voice steady but colder than before. "You opened it," she said. Daniel did not defend himself. "I needed to understand," he replied. There was a long pause. "So did she," Elena said quietly. The audit began within days. External consultants arrived, polite and methodical. Marcus maintained composure, providing access as requested. Daniel cooperated fully, careful not to appear directive. Behind the scenes, Thomas fed him updates. "They're focusing on procurement anomalies," Thomas whispered over a secure line. "They haven't traced the political transfers yet." Daniel realized the audit's scope might be narrower than Lila's suspicions required. If Marcus had insulated the most sensitive transactions, the consultants might conclude procedural errors rather than systemic fraud. Partial exposure would be enough to damage Daniel further, but not enough to topple Marcus. He considered leaking the letter anonymously to regulators. The thought felt both strategic and cowardly. Anonymous leaks invited suspicion and chaos. Direct submission invited retaliation. He weighed the options late into the night, aware that inaction favored Marcus. Meanwhile, media speculation intensified. Analysts debated Daniel's psychological profile, dissecting his career for signs of volatility. Marcus appeared on financial news panels, expressing sorrow and commitment to reform. Watching him perform controlled grief on screen ignited something corrosive in Daniel's chest. Marcus was not just defending himself. He was reshaping public memory of Lila into a cautionary tale about instability. Elena began speaking with an investigative journalist, a move Daniel had warned against. When he confronted her, she met him with unwavering resolve. "If I stay silent, he wins," she said. Daniel felt the echo of his own reasoning. "If you move too fast, he crushes you," he replied. The argument escalated, not into shouting but into irreconcilable strategy. Protecting her meant restraining her. Restraining her meant appearing complicit. "You're still playing by his rules," Elena said finally. "You think you can outmaneuver him in a system he built." The accusation struck deep. Daniel had believed he could weaponize procedure. Elena doubted procedure entirely. The divide between them widened. As the audit progressed, minor irregularities surfaced publicly. Enough to justify internal reforms. Not enough to indict. Marcus announced a restructuring plan, positioning himself as the architect of accountability. Daniel recognized the maneuver. Absorb limited damage to preserve ultimate control. Thomas grew more anxious. "They're narrowing the review window," he said. "Anything before last fiscal year is out of scope." Daniel's pulse quickened. The most significant transfers had occurred earlier. "We need to expand it," Daniel said. Thomas shook his head. "That requires board approval." And the board, though uneasy, was reluctant to escalate beyond visible necessity. Daniel returned to Lila's storage unit, searching deeper. In a box labeled personal, he found a small recorder. His breath caught. He pressed play. Lila's voice filled the dim space, calm but urgent. "If you're listening to this, it means I miscalculated," she said. Daniel felt his throat tighten. She described a meeting with Marcus in which she confronted him about the political transfers. She recorded his evasions, his veiled threats about loyalty and perception. The audio was not a confession, it was context. But context could shift interpretation. Daniel leaned against the wall, absorbing the weight of it. This was leverage. Not definitive proof of murder, but proof of motive. If regulators heard this, they would question the timing of her death more aggressively. Yet releasing it would expose Lila's secret recording, potentially undermining her credibility. He called Elena and asked her to meet him at the unit. When she arrived and heard the recording, her composure fractured for the first time since the funeral. Tears fell silently as Lila's voice recounted her fear of becoming an obstacle. Elena turned to Daniel, eyes blazing. "We go public," she said. Daniel hesitated. "If we release this now, Marcus will claim it's edited, taken out of context," he said. "He'll frame it as corporate disagreement, not threat." Elena stepped closer. "So we wait until he erases the rest?" she demanded. The tension between caution and urgency felt like a physical strain. "We coordinate with regulators first," Daniel said. "Not the press." Elena studied him, searching for hesitation born of fear rather than strategy. "You swear you're not protecting him?" she asked. Daniel met her gaze. "I'm protecting the outcome," he said. It was the most honest answer he could offer. They agreed, reluctantly, to approach regulators through Daniel's attorney, submitting the recording as supplemental evidence. The move escalated the investigation formally. Within days, regulators requested additional documentation and reopened earlier fiscal years. Marcus's composure on television tightened slightly, a hairline fracture in the facade. Privately, Marcus summoned Daniel again. "You've crossed a line," he said without preamble. Daniel did not deny it. "So did you," he replied. Marcus's eyes hardened. "You think this protects you?" he asked. Daniel felt the tremor beneath his calm. "It protects the truth," he said. Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Truth is malleable," he said. "Outcomes are not." Daniel sensed the unspoken warning. Escalation would not remain confined to boardrooms. He left the meeting aware that the conflict had intensified beyond procedural maneuvering. That night, Daniel returned home to find his apartment ransacked. Drawers open, documents scattered. Nothing obviously stolen. The message was clear. He contacted the police, filed a report, knowing it would likely go nowhere. The invasion was psychological, not material. Standing amid the disarray, Daniel felt the cost crystallize. He had provoked Marcus into visible reaction. The audit expanded. Regulators intensified scrutiny. Elena's involvement deepened. Thomas's fear grew. The structure Marcus had built was under strain, but so was everyone within its radius. Daniel picked up the overturned chair and set it upright. He understood now that there would be no incremental dismantling. The system would not erode politely. It would convulse. And in that convulsion, reputations, relationships, and possibly lives would fracture. He looked at the darkened window, seeing his reflection layered over the city lights. He had chosen acceleration over caution. Whether that choice would expose Marcus or simply accelerate his own destruction remained uncertain. And beneath the strategic calculations, beneath the legal maneuvering and corporate chess, one truth persisted like a splinter under skin. He had not yet answered the deeper question of who he was willing to become in order to win. The question followed him into sleep and waited for him when he woke, unchanged, patient. Winning was no longer about survival alone. It was about definition. If he destroyed Marcus using manipulation and coercion, would he be dismantling corruption or inheriting it? Regulators moved quickly once the recording was submitted. Subpoenas expanded. Financial institutions were compelled to release transaction histories previously shielded by layered intermediaries. Marcus responded with visible cooperation and invisible containment. Several mid-level executives were suspended, presented as unfortunate deviations from policy. Daniel recognized the strategy immediately. Sacrifice expendable pieces to preserve the king. Thomas called late one evening, his voice shaking. "They're looking at my emails," he said. "If they think I withheld anything, I'm finished." Daniel pressed his fingers to his temple. "You documented what you were allowed to document," he replied. "You followed directives." Thomas exhaled sharply. "Directives from Marcus," he said. "Not from policy." The distinction was critical. If Thomas testified that directives bypassed formal governance, it would implicate Marcus more directly. "Are you willing to state that?" Daniel asked. The silence on the line stretched. "If I do," Thomas said slowly, "he will bury me." Daniel felt the weight of that reality. Marcus did not need to act illegally to ruin someone. He could discredit, isolate, bankrupt through litigation. "If you don't," Daniel replied quietly, "he might still bury you, just later." Thomas's fear was not abstract, it was practical. He had a mortgage, children, a reputation built on cautious compliance. Daniel understood the moral asymmetry. He was already publicly damaged. Thomas still had something to lose. "I need protection," Thomas said finally. Daniel nodded, though Thomas could not see it. "We'll request whistleblower status," he said. "Through counsel." Quietly. The move escalated the stakes again. Whistleblower petitions triggered internal alarms. Marcus would know someone close to the financial core had shifted. Daniel anticipated retaliation. Not through violence, but through narrative assault. It arrived sooner than expected. A prominent news outlet published an exposé alleging Daniel had authorized several questionable transfers under his own signature. The documents were authentic. Context was missing. The framing suggested personal enrichment rather than structural manipulation. Daniel felt the familiar tightening in his chest as he read the article. Marcus was not defending himself directly. He was isolating Daniel as the origin point. His attorney called within minutes. "This complicates everything," she said. "If public perception turns fully against you, regulators might narrow their focus to you as primary actor." Daniel paced his apartment, stepping over the still unrepaired disarray from the break-in. "The timing is deliberate," he said. "Thomas just initiated whistleblower proceedings." The attorney's silence confirmed the implication. Marcus was tracing internal fractures. "We need to respond," she said. "Deny personal gain. Emphasize systemic directives." Daniel stopped pacing. "If I emphasize directives, I implicate Marcus directly," he said. "Without full documentation, it looks like deflection." The attorney exhaled slowly. "You're already being positioned as rogue," she said. Silence might read as confirmation. Daniel understood the bind. Protecting Thomas required reinforcing the systemic nature of decisions. Reinforcing systemic responsibility required public confrontation with Marcus. Confrontation risked accelerated counterattack. There were no defensive positions left. He agreed to a controlled interview with the same outlet that had published the exposé. In the studio, under harsh lights, he felt the artificial calm of performance settle over him. The interviewer's tone was polite but sharpened by skepticism. "Did you authorize these transfers?" she asked. "Yes," Daniel said evenly, "within a framework established by executive leadership." The phrase was deliberate. The interviewer leaned forward. "Are you suggesting those above you directed misconduct?" she pressed. Daniel met her gaze. "I'm suggesting no single executive operates in isolation," he replied. It was neither accusation nor absolution. It was invitation. The segment aired that evening. Analysts debated whether Daniel was subtly implicating Marcus. Marcus responded the next day with a statement reaffirming his trust in institutional processes and expressing disappointment in attempts to deflect accountability. The language was surgical. Elena watched the interview from her apartment and called Daniel immediately. "You're still measured," she said. "Why are you still measured?" Daniel rubbed his eyes. "Because if I rage, I look guilty," he said. "If I accuse without airtight proof, I look desperate." Elena's voice cracked. "She's dead," she said. "And he's still managing optics." "I know," Daniel replied, and the admission felt heavier than any strategy. "But if I lose credibility entirely, I can't finish what she started." Elena was silent for a moment. "What if finishing it turns you into him?" she asked. The question lingered long after the call ended. Days later, regulators summoned Daniel for extended questioning. The room was colder than the earlier interrogation months before. This time, the questions focused less on the night of Lila's death and more on financial authorizations. "Were you aware these transfers benefited political entities?" an investigator asked. Daniel chose his words carefully. "I was aware of strategic partnerships," he said. "I was not aware of personal enrichment beyond institutional objectives." "Do you believe Marcus benefited personally?" another asked. The directness was new. Daniel felt the gravity of the moment. Accuse and accelerate, deflect, and isolate himself. "I believe decisions were centralized," he said, and transparency was selectively applied. It was as close to accusation as he could move without overstepping evidence. When he left the building, he felt drained but not defeated. The investigation had shifted from individual blame toward structural inquiry. That shift was fragile. Marcus would attempt to redirect it again. Thomas's whistleblower status was granted provisionally. The news leaked within days. Marcus convened another executive session, this time without Daniel present. Thomas informed Daniel afterward that loyalty oaths had been requested, subtle but coercive. He asked who had access to archived communications. Thomas said, "He's narrowing suspects." Daniel realized that Thomas's safety was deteriorating rapidly. "We need to secure you," he said. "Temporary relocation." Thomas resisted. "That makes me look guilty," he said. "It makes you look protected," Daniel replied. The distinction mattered. Meanwhile, Elena's journalist contact published a separate piece highlighting Lila's efforts to initiate audits. The article included excerpts from the recording, carefully contextualized. Public sympathy shifted slightly. Lila was reframed not as volatile, but as reformist. Marcus issued a statement praising her passion while lamenting misunderstandings. The word misunderstanding felt like insult layered over memory. The board began to fracture visibly. Caroline requested emergency governance reforms. Another member resigned quietly. Investors expressed concern. Stock prices fluctuated unpredictably. Marcus's empire was no longer monolithic. It was cracking under sustained pressure. Yet Daniel felt no triumph. Each crack widened instability that could collapse onto employees, families, innocent stakeholders. He had wanted accountability. Now he was watching collateral damage accumulate. Was this justice or simply redistribution of harm? One evening, Marcus requested a final private meeting. Against his attorney's advice, Daniel agreed. They met in the same hotel suite where Lila had died, now professionally cleaned, indistinguishable from any other luxury room. The symbolism was not accidental. Marcus stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. "You've been thorough," he said without turning. Daniel remained near the door, unwilling to step fully into the space. "You've been defensive," he replied. Marcus turned slowly. "I built something resilient," he said. "You're dismantling it out of personal grievance." "She was investigating corruption," Daniel said. Marcus's expression tightened. "She was destabilizing strategic alliances," he corrected. "There's always a narrative." Daniel stepped closer despite himself. "Did you order the transfers?" he asked. Marcus held his gaze. "Leadership involves decisions you may not comprehend fully," he said. It was neither denial nor confession. "And did you order her death?" Daniel's voice was steady but low. Marcus's eyes did not flicker. "Careful," he said. "Accusations without proof are dangerous." The evasion was deliberate. Daniel felt the familiar frustration rise, but he suppressed it. "You think you're winning," Marcus continued. "But if I fall, the institution fractures. Thousands lose stability. You become the man who burned it down." The argument was calculated. Responsibility reframed as recklessness. Daniel felt the weight of it because part of it was true. "If the foundation is rotten, preserving it isn't stability," Daniel replied. Marcus smiled faintly. "You're idealistic now," he said. "That's new." Daniel shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "I'm accountable now." "That's new." Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice. "If you proceed, you go down with me," he said. "Your signatures are everywhere, your authorizations, your silence." The threat was explicit. Mutual destruction. Daniel felt the cold clarity return. "Then we both answer," he said. The words surprised even him. They were not strategic. They were decisive. Marcus studied him for a long moment, recalculating. "You've changed," Marcus said finally. Daniel held his gaze. "I've stopped asking for your approval," he replied. The statement landed between them like a severed tether. When Daniel left the suite, he felt the final line within himself cross quietly. He had accepted the possibility of personal ruin as collateral for exposure. The fear remained, but it no longer dictated restraint. Regulators announced formal charges weeks later, not only against Daniel, but against Marcus and several executives. The charges were complex, financial, procedural. The murder investigation reopened under expanded context. Media coverage intensified, no longer singularly focused on Daniel. Thomas entered protective status. Elena testified publicly about Lila's concerns. The board initiated emergency restructuring. Marcus resigned pending trial but maintained public innocence. Daniel stood outside the courthouse once more, cameras flashing. This time the questions were broader. "Do you regret your involvement?" a reporter asked. Daniel paused. Regret was insufficient. "I regret not questioning sooner," he said. As proceedings moved toward trial, alliances shifted unpredictably. Some former colleagues reached out quietly, offering testimony. Others distanced themselves. Friendships collapsed under scrutiny. Daniel felt isolation deepen even as his narrative partially rehabilitated. Yet resolution remained distant. Trials would stretch for months, perhaps years. Outcomes uncertain. Reputations scarred permanently. Marcus, though charged, remained composed, his legal team formidable. One night, alone in his apartment, Daniel replayed the recording of Lila's voice once more. Not for leverage, for memory. She had known the risk. She had acted anyway. The difference now was that he understood the cost not as abstract sacrifice but as lived consequence. He looked at the city lights again, no longer seeing circuitry, but fault lines. He had chosen acceleration. He had chosen exposure over insulation. Whether that choice would ultimately deliver justice or simply redistribute damage remained unresolved. And as he stood there, aware of the long legal battle ahead, aware that prison was still a possible outcome, aware that Marcus might yet find a way to pivot again, he understood that the war between them was no longer about dominance or narrative. It was about endurance. He did not feel victorious. He did not feel absolved. He felt committed, and that commitment did not resemble courage. It resembled endurance sharpened into something almost punitive. The months that followed stretched into procedural monotony, punctuated by bursts of public spectacle. Pre-trial hearings, motions to dismiss, evidentiary disputes. Marcus's legal team attacked the admissibility of the recording, questioned chain of custody, implied tampering. Daniel sat through each argument, listening to Lila's voice dissected as if it were an accounting error. His own attorneys pressed him relentlessly. "If you testify against Marcus, you must be prepared to incriminate yourself," they said. "The prosecution may offer reduced charges in exchange for full cooperation." Reduced charges meant formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. It meant prison time, even if abbreviated. It meant permanent criminal record. It also meant the possibility of ensuring Marcus faced consequences proportionate to his role. Daniel considered the calculus late at night, alone with spreadsheets and transcripts. If he fought all charges aggressively, he might preserve fragments of reputation. If he cooperated fully, he might secure a clearer narrative, but accept tangible punishment. There was no path that preserved both image and integrity. Elena's stance evolved as well. At first, she pushed for maximum exposure, regardless of collateral damage. Over time, watching the legal attrition erode Daniel visibly, she softened, not in conviction, but in understanding. "You don't have to martyr yourself," she said one evening as they sat across from each other at her kitchen table. Daniel looked at her carefully. "If I protect myself first, I'm still protecting the system she tried to dismantle," he replied. Elena's eyes held his. "There's a difference between accountability and self-destruction," she said. The distinction unsettled him. Was he pursuing justice or seeking atonement? If he allowed himself to be punished beyond necessity, would that honor Lila or simply satisfy his own need for absolution? Thomas testified before a grand jury under sealed proceedings. The strain etched itself into his posture. He avoided eye contact with former colleagues in hallways. "I wake up every night thinking I misremembered something," he confessed to Daniel in a quiet moment. "What if they prove I was wrong?" Daniel felt the weight of shared vulnerability. "You documented what you saw," he said. "Truth doesn't require perfection." Marcus, meanwhile, remained composed in public. His statements were sparse but measured. "I trust the process," he repeated to reporters. The phrase became almost ironic in its repetition, yet behind closed doors, his attorneys pursued aggressive tactics, seeking to sever financial charges from the homicide investigation, to fragment the narrative into isolated disputes. The prosecution's strategy slowly coalesced: establish motive through financial misconduct, link escalating tension between Lila and Marcus to the timing of her death, demonstrate Daniel's initial framing as an attempt to redirect scrutiny. It was intricate, but fragile. Defense attorneys argued that Lila's death was an unfortunate confrontation between Daniel and Lila, exploited opportunistically by competitors. Daniel knew that his own credibility would be decisive. If the jury perceived him as opportunistic or vengeful, Marcus could reframe the entire case as internal power struggle. If they perceived him as complicit but remorseful, cooperating under conscience, the narrative shifted. His attorneys finally presented the formal cooperation agreement. "You admit to authorizing transfers without adequate oversight," they explained. "You testify fully regarding centralized directives. In exchange, recommended sentencing is reduced." Daniel read the document slowly. Each clause felt like incision. Elena watched him sign, not celebrating, not condemning. "This doesn't make you weak," she said quietly. Daniel nodded, though weakness and relief intermingled indistinguishably within him. The courtroom during trial was both sterile and electric. When Daniel took the stand, the weight of months compressed into a single moment. The prosecutor guided him methodically through the financial architecture, his role, Marcus's oversight patterns. He did not dramatize. He did not embellish. He described structure. Defense cross-examination was merciless. "You benefited from these transfers, did you not?" the attorney pressed. "Your compensation increased." Daniel did not evade. "Yes," he said. "Within a framework I did not challenge soon enough." The admission hung in the air. "And you now claim moral awakening only after you were charged?" the defense continued. Daniel met the attorney's gaze. "I claim accountability after someone died trying to correct what I ignored," he replied. The courtroom quieted. The recording of Lila's voice was played, this time not as contested evidence but as contextual anchor. Jurors listened to her measured concerns, to Marcus's evasions. The audio did not contain explicit threat, but it contained something subtler: imbalance. Marcus testified as well. He was poised, articulate, unflinching. He denied ordering any illegal transfers, framing discrepancies as misinterpretations of complex compliance strategies. Regarding Lila's death, he expressed sorrow but denied involvement entirely. suggesting Daniel's guilt-driven narrative had distorted memory. Watching Marcus on the stand, Daniel felt the old gravitational pull. Marcus was persuasive. He spoke in complete structures, exuding confidence. For a moment, Daniel wondered if he had indeed constructed a narrative around ambiguous evidence, if his need for redemption had shaped interpretation. That doubt was the most dangerous element of all. It threatened to erode resolve from within. The trial stretched for weeks. Expert witnesses debated financial intricacies. Forensic analysts discussed ballistics, timelines, inconsistencies in initial police handling. The jury absorbed complexity that resisted simplicity. Outside the courthouse, public opinion fractured. Some viewed Daniel as whistleblower, others as self-serving executive deflecting blame. Marcus retained a core of supporters who framed him as visionary, targeted by overreach. When closing arguments concluded, the waiting began. Daniel found the waiting more punishing than testimony. Without action, his mind replayed every answer he had given, every hesitation. He scrutinized his own motives relentlessly. Elena remained steady beside him, no longer urging aggression but offering presence. "Whatever happens," she said one evening, "you didn't look away." The statement did not absolve him. It grounded him. The verdict arrived on a gray afternoon. The courtroom filled beyond capacity. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears as the jury foreperson stood. On financial misconduct, Marcus was found guilty on multiple counts of conspiracy and obstruction. On Daniel's charges, guilty on reduced counts consistent with his cooperation agreement. On the homicide charge, the verdict was more complicated. Insufficient evidence to convict Marcus directly of ordering the killing, but sufficient to reopen separate proceedings based on newly surfaced testimony regarding coercion and intimidation. The mixed outcome landed heavily. Marcus's composure fractured only briefly as the financial convictions were read. Daniel felt no surge of triumph. He felt the sobering realization that justice rarely arrived whole. It arrived in fragments. Sentencing hearings followed. Marcus faced significant prison time for financial crimes. The homicide question lingered, unresolved but not dismissed. Daniel received a reduced sentence involving limited incarceration and probation, reflecting his cooperation. Standing before the judge, Daniel listened to the formal acknowledgement of his complicity. "Your failure to question centralized directives contributed materially to systemic misconduct," the judge said. "Your subsequent cooperation mitigates but does not erase responsibility." The phrasing was precise. Prison was quieter than Daniel had imagined. The routine stripped away titles, narratives, media speculation. It left him with time. Time to confront not only Marcus's actions but his own passivity. Time to sit with Lila's recorded voice without strategic overlay. Elena visited regularly. They did not always speak about the case. Sometimes they spoke about ordinary things, reclaiming fragments of normalcy. Their relationship, strained by strategy and suspicion, settled into something more honest, less performative. Marcus appealed his convictions aggressively. Legal battles continued beyond Daniel's incarceration. News filtered in sporadically. Some convictions were upheld, others remanded. The homicide investigation persisted, bolstered by testimony from former associates, emboldened by the financial verdict. Daniel's release arrived without spectacle. No cameras waited, no statements required. He stepped outside into unremarkable daylight and felt neither redeemed nor destroyed. He felt altered. The company he had helped build underwent restructuring under new leadership. Policies tightened. Oversight expanded. The empire was diminished but not erased. Thousands retained employment. Some blamed Daniel for instability. Others credited him for reform. Marcus's final legal fate remained partially unresolved when Daniel re-entered civilian life. Appeals dragged. Separate proceedings loomed. The narrative refused clean closure. Daniel did not seek public platforms. He declined interviews. Instead, he accepted a modest consulting role focused on compliance reform for smaller firms. The work lacked glamour. It demanded vigilance. It felt, in some measure, corrective. One evening, standing again before a window overlooking the city, Daniel reflected not on victory but on cost. He had lost reputation, time, financial standing. He had gained clarity about his own susceptibility to authority, about the seduction of centralized power. He understood now that the war with Marcus had never been solely external. It had been internal, a battle between ambition and accountability. Marcus embodied the extreme of one. Lila had attempted to restore the other. Daniel had oscillated until crisis forced decision. He did not romanticize his transformation. He remained capable of rationalization, aware that vigilance required maintenance. But he no longer sought validation from figures like Marcus. That tether had been severed irreversibly. The legal saga continued in headlines he read, with measured detachment. Marcus's appeals faltered gradually. Additional testimony regarding coercive tactics surfaced, strengthening the reopened homicide inquiry. The final chapter of that aspect remained unwritten, suspended in judicial deliberation. Daniel visited Lila's grave on the anniversary of her death. He did not speak grand promises. He acknowledged quietly that he had failed her early and stood with her later. The balance would never be equal. As he walked away, he felt no cinematic closure. He felt continuity. Accountability was not a moment. It was a posture sustained over time. And though the institutions had shifted, though Marcus's dominance had fractured, Daniel understood that systems could rot again if vigilance dulled. The story had not concluded in a blaze of moral certainty. It had settled into a sober understanding that integrity required repeated choice. He walked back toward the city, aware that his name would always carry shadow and footnote. Yet within that shadow was something steadier than ambition. He no longer needed to win. He needed to remain accountable.